She bought a small house for $500, thinking she would finally find peace and quiet. But when she lifted the old floor, she realized that this house had been keeping a secret for decades. What was underneath changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The city had become too heavy for Evelyn Harper to bear. It pressed down on her like the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts, a gray, endless hum that filled her mornings and bled into her nights. The apartment where she had lived for more than 3 decades no longer felt like a home, but a box filled with echoes. Her husband's laughter that had long faded, the ticking of a clock that seemed louder since he was gone, and the weary sigh of the wind against the thin glass of her kitchen window. At 68, Evelyn found herself surrounded by the ghosts of routines that no longer made sense. She still woke at 6, brewed weak tea, and arranged the same 3 books on her table, a small act of order in a life that had begun to lose shape. After her husband's death 5 years earlier, time had changed its rhythm. The days didn't pass anymore. They pooled like rainwater in the cracks of her mind. Friends had drifted away, first slowly, then completely, each visit shorter than the one before. She was left with silence and the faint smell of old paper that clung to her clothes from the library, where she had worked her entire life. Even after retirement, she returned there once a week to help sort donations or shelve books. It was her only tether to purpose, though the walls of the library seemed older too, the lights dimmer, the students fewer. The world outside her small orbit kept rushing forward, but she had stopped somewhere along the way, anchored in grief. It was on one of those quiet afternoons at the library, while she was flipping through a stack of old newspapers destined for recycling, that she saw the ad. The words were small and plain, almost easy to miss. House for sale, $500. No agents, only for someone ready to listen to the silence. She read it 3 times, certain she had misread the price. $500 could barely pay a month's rent, much less buy a house. And yet, there it was, printed in faded ink, with a phone number written neatly below. The phrasing unsettled her, ready to listen to the silence. It was a strange thing to write in an advertisement, more like a warning or an invitation whispered by something unseen. She tore out the page and carried it home in her handbag. That evening, she placed it on her table beside the lamp and stared at it, while the city groaned outside her window. The cars below honked and hissed, sirens flared, and the rhythm of strangers' lives pulsed beneath her floor. Silence. That was what she longed for, though she had never dared name it aloud. She dialed the number before she could change her mind. The man who answered spoke with a voice that sounded as though it came from a long way off. He didn't give his name. He confirmed that the price was correct, the house was real, and the documents were in order. When she asked about its condition, he said only, "Old, but standing." His answers were brief, his tone weary, as though he had repeated them too many times before. He gave her an address, a date, and told her to bring cash if she was serious. She tried to ask why it was so cheap, but the line went dead. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The ceiling seemed lower, the walls closer. The hum of the refrigerator grated on her nerves, and the ticking clock sounded like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. She rose before dawn, made tea she didn't drink, and watched the sky lighten over the rooftops. When the first sunbeam cut through the gray, she folded the newspaper clipping and tucked it into her coat pocket. The decision had been made. 2 days later, she stood at the bus station with a small suitcase, the same one she and her husband had once used for weekend trips. The city spread behind her in a haze of smoke and glass. When the bus pulled away, she felt something like relief, thin and sharp, like the first breath after a long illness. The road unwound before her, taking her through a landscape that grew steadily quieter. The buildings gave way to fields. Telephone poles replaced billboards. The air grew clearer, touched with the scent of soil. By afternoon, she saw hills rising in the distance, and beyond them, the outline of a town so small it seemed to belong to another time. The sign at the bus stop read Willow Creek. The driver nodded toward a gravel road that disappeared between clusters of bare trees. "That's the way," he said simply, and drove off. Evelyn stood for a while, her suitcase by her feet, listening to the stillness. The town was hushed. She could hear the flutter of a bird's wings, the rustle of dry leaves, even her own breath. It unnerved her and comforted her at the same time. She followed the gravel path, passing a few wooden houses with sagging porches and shuttered windows. A man repairing a fence paused to watch her, but said nothing. When she asked for directions, he only lifted his chin toward the road ahead and returned to his work. The silence of the place had weight. It wasn't emptiness, but a kind of listening. When she finally saw the house, it appeared first as a blur of white between the trees. It was smaller than she expected, standing at the edge of a clearing bordered by a crooked fence. The paint was peeling in long strips, and the roof sagged like tired shoulders. Yet there was something about it, a dignity beneath the decay, as though the house had endured too much to care what it looked like. The man from the phone call was waiting by the gate. He was middle-aged, dressed in a dark coat too fine for the setting. His face was pale, drawn, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet her by name, didn't shake her hand, only handed her a set of yellowed papers. "Everything's in order," he said. "No mortgage, no liens, cash only." She counted out the bills with trembling fingers. He signed, she signed, and that was all. When she asked if the house had any history she should know about, his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Every house has a history," he said, turning away. "Some more than others." Then he was gone, his car disappearing down the road until only the dust remained. Evelyn stood by the gate, holding the key, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The house looked at her with its dark windows, hollow and expectant. She opened the creaking gate and stepped through. The grass was tall, brushing against her legs. The porch boards flexed beneath her weight, releasing small sighs of dust. Inside, the air smelled of time-old wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like the memory of rain. The living room was small, its wallpaper faded to the color of parchment. A single armchair sat in the corner, covered in a thin film of dust. The kitchen held a rusted sink, an empty shelf, and a table missing one leg. In the bedroom, an old iron bed frame leaned against the wall, its mattress sagging like a tired breath. The house was a ruin, but it was hers. She walked from room to room, touching the walls, whispering to herself, "It's quiet." That evening she made tea on a small gas stove she had brought in her bag, and sat on the porch, watching the trees. The sky deepened to violet. The first stars flickered, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth. It was peaceful, yet not entirely still. There was a restlessness in the air, as though the house were adjusting to her presence, or she to its. When darkness settled fully, she lit a candle and wandered through the rooms once more. The flame threw long shadows that danced across the walls, stretching and twisting with the movement of the air. In the quiet, every sound magnified the creak of the floor, the faint whisper of wind through a crack in the window frame, the slow tick of her watch. When she finally lay down on the mattress, exhaustion overcame her, but her dreams were filled with soft, rhythmic noises, thuds that seemed to come from beneath her, measured and deliberate, like footsteps pacing slowly below the floorboards. She woke before dawn, her heart beating hard. The sound had stopped, leaving behind only silence. She sat up, her breath clouding faintly in the cold air, and listened. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. The candle she had forgotten to extinguish had burned down to a stub, its wax pooling on the wooden floor like spilled light. For a long moment she stayed still, then smiled faintly at her own fear. "It's just an old house," she whispered, though the words felt thin. When the sun rose, its light filtered through the dusty glass, painting golden lines across the room. Evelyn stood by the window and watched the trees sway. The world outside looked almost unreal, too quiet, too soft. She felt the strangest sensation, something between belonging and being tested. The house wasn't empty, not entirely. It carried the weight of years, of whispers she couldn't yet understand. Later that morning, she swept the floors, opened the windows, and let the wind in. Dust danced in the air, spinning like faint memories. She worked until her arms ached, until the scent of old wood filled her lungs, and the creaking of the boards became familiar. By the time the sun began to lower, she felt a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. It was not comfort exactly, but the beginning of something close to it. As night returned and she lit another candle, Evelyn sat in the armchair and closed her eyes. The house was quiet now, utterly still. And yet, beneath that stillness, she could almost sense a pulse, slow, steady, deep in the floor beneath her feet. It felt like the heartbeat of something ancient, something patient, waiting for her to listen. She didn't yet know that the house she had bought for $500 would change everything she believed about silence, about history, and about herself. For now, she simply sat in the flickering glow, the key to her new life resting on the table beside her, unaware that below her feet, in the cold earth, a secret older than the town itself was waiting to be found. The wind sighed against the windows, and the house answered softly, almost tenderly, as if whispering to her in return. It wasn't loneliness she felt anymore, but the beginning of a strange companionship between a woman who had lost her purpose and a house that had been waiting far too long to be remembered. Morning came softly to the little house, seeping through the thin curtains like a hesitant guest. Evelyn Harper woke to the sound of birds outside her window, a sound so unfamiliar that for a moment she didn't know where she was. It had been years since she had heard anything but sirens, traffic, and the murmurs of her neighbors through paper-thin walls. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the silence wasn't empty. It was full, layered with the quiet sounds of life, the whisper of leaves, the creak of settling wood, the faint hum of the morning breeze brushing against the window pane. It was, she thought, the kind of silence a person could grow old in without feeling lonely. She rose slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the old mattress, and pulled back the curtains. The light outside was pale and tender. Mist clung to the trees beyond the yard, curling in ribbons around the leaning fence. The grass sparkled with dew, and for a fleeting second, Evelyn felt like she had woken in a painting. She made herself a cup of tea and carried it to the porch, where she sat wrapped in her old cardigan, listening to the steady rhythm of the world breathing around her. She had dreamed the night before, vividly, of footsteps echoing below the floor, of voices she couldn't understand. But in the gentle light of morning, the memory felt distant, like a story told long ago. By mid-morning, she had gathered the strength to begin her work. The house needed care. It was weary in every corner. Dust lay like a thin gray skin over every surface, and the air carried a faint bitterness of mold. She tied a scarf over her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and began to clean. There was a satisfaction in the work, a rhythm she recognized from her years in the library. Dusting, arranging, restoring order where time had scattered it. As she swept, the broom's bristles stirred up clouds that shimmered in the sunlight before fading into the air. Each movement was deliberate, patient, a small reclamation of her new home from neglect. But as the hours passed, small peculiarities began to catch her attention. The floors in the front room trembled faintly underfoot, more so than the others. When she walked from the window to the far corner, the board seemed to hum, not with sound, but with a faint vibration, as though something below shifted in response to her weight. She paused several times, testing it, pressing her palm against the wood. The sensation was unmistakable, subtle but alive, like the faint pulse of a creature sleeping just beneath the surface. By noon, she had convinced herself it was imagination, the effect of age and wood expanding with the warmth of day. Yet when she paused to wipe her forehead, she felt a cool thread of air drift across her ankles. It was gentle, almost imperceptible, but strange. The windows were closed, and the door to the porch stood still. She crouched, running her hand along the floorboards until she found a thin crack between two planks. From it rose a whisper of chill, the kind of cold that belonged not to air, but to earth. The draft carried with it a faint, damp smell stone, soil, and something older. That afternoon, she opened the back door to let the breeze in and stepped outside to examine the foundation. The walls were old, built from stone blocks weathered by decades, perhaps a century. She ran her hand over them, feeling the rough surface beneath her fingertips. Everything about the house spoke of another time, another set of hands. Yet there was no sign of a cellar door, no exterior entrance that might explain the hollow space beneath her feet. Inside, the hours drifted quietly. She cleaned, scrubbed, and rearranged. She found small remnants of former lives, a porcelain teacup with a hairline crack, a child's marbles hidden behind a loose board, a photograph half faded, showing a family of 4 standing in front of the very same porch where she had sat that morning. Their faces were indistinct, the smiles blurred by time, but she could sense something solemn about them, as if they, too, had lived with the same listening stillness that surrounded her now. As dusk settled, Evelyn made a modest dinner and ate by candlelight. The electricity in the house flickered unpredictably. She had yet to trust it fully. The candle's flame cast a warm golden circle around her, but the edges of the room remained drowned in shadow. The wind outside had risen, brushing through the trees and rattling the windows like quiet knocking fingers. She tried to ignore the unease that lingered in her chest, the sense that she was not quite alone. The noises of the house had a pattern, now gentle creaks that followed her steps, faint groans as though the wood stretched itself awake after long years of silence. That night, she lay in bed, watching the play of candlelight on the ceiling. Her thoughts drifted between comfort and disquiet. She told herself the sounds were harmless, the house adjusting, breathing, remembering how to live. But just as she began to drift toward sleep, a dull thump sounded beneath her. Then another, softer, farther away. She held her breath. For a moment, all was still, and then came 3 slow taps, perfectly spaced, rising from below the floorboards. She sat up, heart hammering, her eyes straining in the dim light. "Mice," she whispered aloud, though she didn't quite believe it. She waited, but the tapping didn't return. The silence that followed was thicker than before, heavier. She blew out the candle and lay back down, eyes open to the dark until exhaustion finally claimed her. The following morning, the sunlight felt weaker, as if the house had drawn some of its light away during the night. Evelyn moved through the rooms with a new attentiveness. She began to notice how certain parts of the floor dipped slightly, as if weight had once pressed there. In the living room, near the center, the boards looked subtly newer than the rest, the nails cleaner, less rusted. She crouched to examine them, running her fingers along the seams. The faint tremor she had felt before returned, pulsing beneath her fingertips like the echo of distant footsteps. She fetched a small hammer from the shed outside, a tool left by some forgotten owner, and gently tapped at the boards, listening. Most of them rang with the dull thud of solid wood, but when she reached the center of the room, the tone changed. It was hollow. A chill ran through her. She tapped again, slower this time, tracing the edges of the sound. It extended in a rough rectangle, perhaps the size of a doorway. The discovery unsettled her. For the rest of the day she avoided that part of the floor, telling herself she'd been mistaken. She cleaned the kitchen, dusted the shelves, and washed the few dishes she'd found. But her mind kept circling back to the same place, to the hollow resonance that had answered her touch. That evening, as the last of the light faded from the windows, she found herself standing once again in the living room, staring at the floor. The candle in her hand flickered. The air was cooler there, and the faint draft brushed her ankles, like a question waiting to be asked. Slowly, she moved the heavy wooden cabinet that stood against the wall, a massive thing that must have been there for decades. Dust rose in gray clouds, making her cough. Beneath it, she saw something that froze her in place. The wallpaper, yellowed and peeling, bore faint vertical lines, like seams covered long ago. She touched them with trembling fingers, feeling a shallow groove beneath. She fetched a small kitchen knife and, hesitating only a moment, began to lift away the brittle paper. It came off in long strips, curling as it fell, revealing what lay beneath a narrow wooden door set flush against the wall, its iron handle dark with rust. The air that spilled out through the cracks was icy, and it carried the scent of damp earth and something older, a smell that seemed almost like time itself. Evelyn stepped back, the candle trembling in her grip. The discovery filled her with both dread and wonder. A hidden door, a secret deliberately sealed away. She stood in silence, staring at it, the sound of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. The logical part of her mind whispered that she should leave it be. People sealed doors for a reason. But another part, a deeper, older instinct, urged her forward. She pressed her hand against the handle. The metal bit into her palm, colder than she expected. It didn't move. She tried again, putting her weight into it, but the door held firm. Kneeling, she examined the edges. The wood was thick, bound with nails so corroded they looked almost melted into the grain. Yet the outline of the doorway was clear. Something waited behind it. For the rest of the night she couldn't stop thinking about it. She sat in the armchair with the candle burning low, staring across the room where the faint shape of the hidden door lingered in shadow. Every time the wind sighed against the windows, she imagined she heard something answer, a faint breath rising from below, like the house exhaling. The next morning she returned with renewed resolve. The air was heavy with mist, and the light struggled through the windows in dull gray bands. She took a screwdriver from a drawer, wedged it beneath the handle, and pried. The rust gave way with a sudden screech that echoed through the house like a cry. Dust showered down as the latch loosened. Evelyn coughed, eyes watering, but kept working until, with a sharp crack, the door shifted. A wave of cold air rolled out, dense and ancient. Inside was darkness. Not the soft shadow of night, but a thick, living dark that swallowed her candlelight almost completely. She leaned closer and saw the top of a narrow staircase carved from stone, descending steeply into the earth. The steps were rough, worn by time. The air smelled of wet stone and decay. For a moment she stood at the threshold, gripping the frame, her heart pounding. Every sensible thought in her mind screamed to close the door, to forget what she had seen. But curiosity was stronger. It had guided her all her life through the pages of books, through dusty archives, through the labyrinths of forgotten stories. And now it called her again. She lifted the candle higher, took a deep breath, and placed one foot on the first step. The wood groaned behind her as she crossed the threshold. The air grew colder as she descended. Her breath formed small clouds before her face. Each step echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the walls of earth and stone. The staircase curved slightly, leading deeper than she had imagined. Her candle flickered, throwing trembling circles of light over the walls, revealing scratches and marks carved into the stone lines that might have been writing once, but were too eroded to read. When she reached the bottom, the passage widened. The ground beneath her feet changed from stone to compacted soil. She raised the candle, and the sight that unfolded before her stole her breath. A vast chamber stretched out, its ceiling low and arched, its walls lined with shelves carved directly into the rock. On those shelves lay books, scrolls, wooden boxes, and glass jars coated with dust. In the far corner stood a large wooden chest, its lid cracked open just enough for her to glimpse the yellowed edges of papers within. For a long time, Evelyn couldn't move. The air was thick, heavy with centuries. It felt wrong to breathe too loudly, as if she might disturb something sacred. Slowly, she stepped forward. The candlelight shimmered over the objects, revealing their details. Leather-bound volumes, with gold lettering half-faded, maps drawn in ink that had bled into the paper, pieces of fabric, coins, and what looked like a child's shoe, tiny and brittle. She realized then that this was not a cellar built for storage. It was a vault, a library beneath the earth, a secret kept in silence for longer than she could imagine. Her hands trembled as she touched one of the books, brushing away the dust. The leather flaked under her fingers, but the title remained faintly visible, written in a language she couldn't read. The cold deepened around her, but she felt no fear, now only awe. The candlelight danced along the stone, and the shadow seemed to breathe. Somewhere behind her, the faintest sound stirred, like a sigh escaping from the walls themselves. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was only darkness. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, the heart of the house beating around her, and understood that her life had changed. Whatever lay hidden beneath this place had waited for her, for someone who would not look away, someone who would listen to the silence. The candle flickered, the flame shrinking as the wax melted onto her hand, but she did not move. She knew she would return. The secret beneath the floor had revealed itself, and now it was part of her, as surely as her own heartbeat. When she finally climbed the stairs back toward the faint light above, the door closed behind her with a sigh, like an exhalation of relief. The house settled once more into stillness, and Evelyn stood in the dim room, trembling, her mind echoing with the memory of what lay below. She didn't yet know that the discovery would awaken more than history, that the quiet she had sought would soon turn into something else entirely, something that would test every ounce of her courage and faith. But as she leaned against the wall, her candle extinguished, and her pulse slowly calmed, she felt something profound. She was not alone anymore. The silence she had come to embrace was no longer empty. It was alive. The night after Evelyn's descent into the underground chamber passed in fragments of restless sleep. She dreamed of voices murmuring in languages she didn't know, of candle flames bending toward her as if drawn by her breath, of shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. When she woke before dawn, her body ached, and her heart felt unsteady, caught between fear and exhilaration. For a long while she sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the soft groans of the old house around her, feeling the pulse of something new and unseen beneath her feet. The secret was no longer hidden. it had chosen her. As the morning light crept across the wooden floorboards, Evelyn rose with purpose. The fragile veil of disbelief that had protected her was gone. In its place was an almost reverent curiosity. She prepared herself a simple breakfast, but hardly touched it. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered what she needed: a sturdier lantern, her notebook, a pair of gloves, and the old reading glasses she hadn't used in years. The air in the house was unusually still. When she opened the narrow hidden door, the cold drifted up to greet her like a breath from another world. The stairs groaned softly as she descended once more, the lantern casting trembling circles of light upon the walls. This time, she moved slowly, allowing her eyes to adjust to the darkness. The silence below was complete. It was not merely the absence of sound, but a presence of its own, thick and intimate, pressing close around her. When she reached the bottom, the sight of the chamber filled her with the same quiet awe she had felt before. It was vast, untouched, alive in its stillness. She had expected the wonder to fade after her first visit, but instead it deepened, mingled now with a growing sense of responsibility. Evelyn set the lantern on a stone table near the center and began to explore more carefully. Dust lay heavy over everything, disturbed only by her footsteps. On one of the shelves, she found a ledger bound in cracked leather. The pages were yellowed and delicate, the ink faded, but still legible in places. As she turned them, she realized it was a record, a list of names and dates and symbols. Some were crossed out, others circled. The earliest entry bore a date from more than 200 years ago. Her breath caught. This was no ordinary cellar. It was a vault of lives. She found letters sealed with wax so brittle it crumbled at her touch, maps drawn in careful ink, showing lines that twisted through forests and mountains, and notebooks filled with unfamiliar handwriting. Many of the pages were written in languages she only half recognized: French, Latin, perhaps even something older. She could not read most of it, but she felt the weight of meaning pressing through the paper, as if the words themselves carried memory. On a lower shelf, she discovered a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small pair of iron manacles, rusted and fused together, too small to fit an adult's wrists. Evelyn held them in her gloved hands, her throat tightening. She placed the manacles down gently, afraid even her breath might disturb the silence that seemed to guard them. The realization struck her with quiet force. Whoever had built this place had not done so for wealth or vanity. It was a refuge, a record, a sanctuary of remembrance. The shelves were filled with history deliberately hidden from the world above. She ran her hand over the nearest wall, feeling the carvings etched deep into the stone symbols, intertwined with letters. Some shaped like spirals, others like open eyes. They reminded her of ancient manuscripts she had once shelved in the rare book section of the library, except these were alive with purpose, with defiance. Hours passed unnoticed. She moved from one table to another, making notes in her book sketches of symbols, fragments of text, quick descriptions of where each item rested. At one point, she found a small wooden box filled with folded slips of parchment, each marked by a different hand. She unfolded one carefully. It contained a short message written in graceful script. For those who seek truth, remember that silence was our shelter. She read it again and again, her eyes stinging with tears she hadn't expected. The words seemed written directly to her. When she finally climbed back to the living room, dusk had already settled. The house above felt different now, less mysterious, more protective, as if it knew she had seen its heart. She set her notebook on the kitchen table, her pages filled with hurried writing, and made herself tea she barely tasted. That night, she could not stop thinking about the people whose stories were preserved below. Each item she had touched felt like a thread connecting her to those who had lived and struggled long before her birth. By the following morning, the decision was made. She needed help. The magnitude of what she had uncovered was too great for her alone. She spent the better part of the day searching through the town's newspaper and local records until she found mention of a historian affiliated with a nearby university, a Professor Thomas Langley, who specialized in regional archives and early settlement history. The description of his work seemed modest, but his reputation was solid. She hesitated for hours before finally gathering the courage to call. When the line connected, his voice sounded brisk but kind. Evelyn explained, in careful, measured words, that she had recently purchased an old house near Willow Creek and found something unusual beneath it: artifacts, books, perhaps of historical value. She did not mention the extent of what she had seen, only that she believed it to be worth examination. There was a long silence on the line. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. He asked precise questions about the age of the materials, the structure of the chamber, and then, with quiet urgency, requested her address. He would come, he said, the next day. The hours that followed were long. Evelyn paced the house, alternately relieved and anxious. She wondered if she had made a mistake. But when Professor Langley arrived the following afternoon, stepping out of his car with a satchel and a weathered notebook, her unease softened. He was a tall man with thinning gray hair, his spectacles slipping down the bridge of his nose as he greeted her politely. His manner was calm, scholarly, yet as soon as he crossed the threshold of the house, his eyes sharpened. He seemed to sense something beneath the quiet. Evelyn led him to the living room. When she moved aside the cabinet and opened the hidden door, the professor froze. The breath left him in a slow exhale. "Good heavens," he murmured. "How did you find this?" She didn't answer. She merely held the lantern and gestured for him to follow. The descent was slow. When they reached the chamber, Langley stood for a long moment, his lantern sweeping across the shelves, the books, the relics. His lips moved soundlessly before he spoke. "This is extraordinary," he whispered. "Do you have any idea what you've uncovered?" For hours they moved through the vault together. He examined the books with trembling reverence, his hand steady despite his excitement. He muttered notes under his breath, deciphering fragments of Latin, identifying crests from long-vanished provinces. "These aren't just personal records," he said. "This could be the most complete private archive of early settlers, maybe even something older. Look at this. Maps of underground routes, coded correspondence. It's incredible." Evelyn listened, but said little. His enthusiasm was contagious, yet beneath it, she sensed something else. The gleam in his eyes, the quickness of his breath. It wasn't only academic wonder. It was hunger. He spoke of publication, of funding, of how such a discovery could change reputations and careers. Each time he said "we," her stomach tightened. She had not thought of ownership before, but now the word unsettled her. By the time they returned upstairs, the house had grown cold. The professor sat at the kitchen table, scribbling furiously in his notebook while she poured them tea. "You mustn't tell anyone else," he said at last. "Not yet. Let me make some calls discreetly. I can have this authenticated, cataloged properly. But secrecy is vital until we secure it." Evelyn nodded, though unease pooled in her chest. When he left, dusk was falling. His car disappeared down the road, leaving only the whisper of tires on gravel. For a long while she stood at the gate, staring after him, uncertain whether to feel relief or dread. That night, sleep did not come. The walls seemed to shift around her, the house no longer merely quiet, but listening again. She rose several times to check the locks. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps outside. Soft, deliberate, stopping just beyond the porch. When she opened the door, the yard lay empty beneath the moonlight. but the gate swung slowly back and forth, as if recently touched. The next day brought signs she couldn't ignore. At the grocery store, two strangers lingered too long by the entrance, their eyes following her as she passed. When she returned home, faint boot prints marked the soil near her fence. That evening, she found a note tucked under her front door, unsigned. Some secrets are not yours to keep. Fear took root in her, then not for herself, but for the cellar. She locked the hidden door with a length of chain and an old padlock she found in the shed. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that word had already spread. Perhaps Professor Langley had spoken too soon. Perhaps the whispers had already begun. In the days that followed, the tension in the town seemed to shift. Neighbors who had once ignored her now offered polite nods that felt too rehearsed. A man in a pressed suit approached her near the post office, his smile thin, his words careful. He claimed to be an antiques dealer, mentioned he'd heard of her remarkable discovery, and offered a price that made her dizzy. Evelyn turned him away, her voice trembling but firm. 2 days later, another envelope appeared in her mailbox, offering twice as much. It was then she understood the depth of what she had unleashed. The vault beneath her home was no longer just a secret. It was a treasure others would covet, exploit, destroy. Each creak of the floorboards above it felt like a warning, a reminder that she was not its owner, but its guardian. The weight of that realization pressed down on her shoulders until even her sleep was restless. One night, as the wind howled outside and branches scraped against the windows, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, her notebook open before her. The pages were filled with her neat handwriting, sketches of the cellar, copied phrases from the journals she had dared to read. Her lantern burned low, its flame trembling. She thought of the hands that had written those old letters, of the voices preserved in silence beneath the earth. She thought of the greed that had already begun to circle. Tears slipped down her cheeks, though she didn't notice them at first. She had come here seeking peace, but the house had given her purpose instead, a burden, perhaps, but one that felt strangely right. The cellar had trusted her with its story. It had chosen her to remember. As the flame flickered and the shadows deepened, she whispered into the stillness, "I won't let them take you." The words hung in the air, fragile and certain. Somewhere beneath her, deep in the stone and soil, she thought she heard a faint echo, as if the house itself answered her vow. When she finally blew out the lantern, the darkness around her felt different. Less lonely, more watchful. The weight of discovery had become her responsibility, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were unlike any Evelyn Harper had known in her long, ordered life. Time itself seemed to shift in the small house on the edge of the clearing, moving in uncertain waves between fear and calm. The world beyond her gate grew distant, as though the road that led back to town no longer quite connected to the one she lived on. She rose early each morning, yet her days were shaped not by clocks, but by the subtle breathing of the house, its creaks, its sighs, its strange low hum at twilight, when the earth cooled and the wind slipped through the trees. Beneath all of it, underfoot, she could feel the pulse of the hidden chamber, steady and patient, like the slow beating of a buried heart. She had expected Professor Langley to return within days, perhaps even with assistance, or men in suits bearing equipment. But no one came. Instead, there was only silence, deeper and heavier than before, though not empty. The letter she wrote to him on the third day after his visit was never answered. By the fifth, she began to wonder if he had ever truly intended to keep her confidence, or if the silence meant he had already said too much. The memory of the note left at her door haunted her. Some secrets are not yours to keep. It was not only a warning, but a truth she could feel in her bones. Evelyn started to take precautions. She nailed the back windows shut and fitted new locks on the front door. The chain across the cellar hatch she reinforced with an iron clasp, one that had belonged to her husband's old tool chest. When she worked, she kept the radio on a habit from the city, but even the voices of strangers could not mask the sense that something unseen was watching over the house. At times, she thought she heard faint movement outside, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. But when she went to the window, there was only wind and shadow. The stillness beyond the fence had become almost sacred, as if the land itself were holding its breath with her. One night, as the fog rolled thick across the clearing, Evelyn was woken by a sharp clatter. Her heart pounded as she sat upright in bed. The sound had come from downstairs. She reached for the lantern on her nightstand, her hands trembling as she lit it, the match flaring weakly before catching. The air was cold, biting against her skin. She moved quietly through the hallway, the floorboard sighing under her bare feet. The light quivered as she descended the stairs. In the kitchen, the back door stood ajar. She was certain she had locked it. The night outside was white with mist. She could see no one, yet she felt the weight of eyes in the dark. When she stepped forward, her foot brushed against something on the floor, a small pile of soil, damp and black, as though scooped fresh from the ground. It lay scattered across the threshold, a handful of earth brought in from somewhere outside. She closed the door and bolted it, her breath coming quick and shallow. The sound that followed, a slow, steady tapping from beneath the floorboards, froze her in place. It was faint, but deliberate, like the rhythmic strike of a finger on wood. She stood listening until the tapping stopped, then waited longer still, her hand pressed to her chest until her heartbeat slowed. That night, she did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the hidden door in the living room, the lantern flickering beside her. She whispered softly into the stillness, not sure to whom she spoke. "I know," she said. "I understand. I won't let them touch you." The words felt strange on her tongue, but they eased the weight in her chest. When she finally rose and went to bed, she dreamed not of fear, but of light filtering through stone, of voices speaking in a language that wasn't hers, yet somehow carried her name. The next morning dawned bright and cool. The fog had lifted, leaving the air sharp and clean. Evelyn spent the day reinforcing her promise. She cleared the weeds that had grown wild along the fence, swept the porch, and repaired the broken shutters. In the afternoon, she painted the front door pale blue, the same shade she remembered from her childhood home. The house seemed to respond, the creaks quieter, the air lighter, as though approving her care. For the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of belonging that went beyond ownership. It was as if she had been claimed. Her resolve hardened. Whatever lay beneath the floor, it had waited too long to be taken by greed. She decided to protect it not through secrecy alone, but through preservation. In the following days, she organized what she could, cataloging each note and sketch she had made in her notebook. Some evenings, she sat by the fire reading through her entries, tracing the curves of the symbols she had copied from the walls of the chamber. Though she did not understand them, she began to feel their rhythm, the way the shapes seemed to echo the patterns of sound in nature, wind and water, and the movement of the stars. Weeks passed in this way, quiet, but not idle. From time to time, letters arrived in her mailbox, some polite, others insistent, all inquiring about the collection. She burned them in the stove without reading beyond the first line. Once, a man came to the gate with a briefcase, saying he represented interested historians. His tone was too smooth, his smile too knowing. Evelyn told him he had the wrong house. When he persisted, she closed the door in his face. After that, she saw him twice more at a distance. Once parked down the road, once standing by the fence at dusk. The house did not seem to welcome him. Each time he approached, the wind rose sharply, rattling the branches until he turned and left. As autumn deepened, the leaves around the clearing turned gold and rust. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of rain and wood smoke. Evelyn's days became slower, gentler. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons reading near the fire, and her nights writing by candlelight. Sometimes she would descend into the cellar, her lantern throwing long shadows across the stone walls. The air there was cold, but not unfriendly. She spoke to the silence as if it were an old friend, telling it about the weather, about the birds that nested in the trees outside, about the people who still wrote to her, but no longer frightened her. It comforted her to think the chamber listened. One evening, as she dusted the shelves below, she noticed something she hadn't before. A small gap in the far wall, where the stone had cracked. Behind it, faintly visible, was a thin glimmer of light, soft and golden. She crouched and touched the edge of the crack. The stone crumbled slightly beneath her fingers. She hesitated, then pressed harder, widening the gap until her lantern could cast its glow through. Beyond it lay a smaller room, barely more than a hollow in the rock. Inside was a single wooden chest, unmarked, its surface smooth and dark. Her breath caught. Carefully, she squeezed through the opening, her knees brushing against the rough stone. The chest was heavy with age. She lifted the lid, and the hinges groaned softly. Inside lay a stack of folded linens, yellowed with time, and beneath them a bundle of papers tied with string. She pulled it free, her hands shaking, and carried it to the main room. When she untied the knot, the papers fell open in her lap. They were letters, dozens of them, written in a delicate hand. The ink had faded, but she could make out enough to understand. They spoke of refuge, of journeys made under cover of night, of people hidden and protected within these walls. The writers described families saved from persecution, children spirited away through secret paths. The house had not only preserved history, it had been part of it. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she read. The chamber beneath her home was not a tomb, but a testament. It had kept alive the memory of courage, of compassion, of defiance against cruelty. For centuries it had waited for someone who would not exploit it, but honor it. She pressed her palm to the cold stone beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll keep it safe. I promise." The following morning she wrote a letter, not to Langley, nor to any of the collectors who had hounded her, but to a small historical society in a distant town. She described the discovery only in part, omitting all details that might draw greed or fame. Her words were simple, that she wished to donate a collection of anonymous letters to their archive to ensure the stories of unnamed lives would endure. She signed it with her own name and no return address. When she mailed it that afternoon, she felt a lightness she had not known in years. Winter came early to Willow Creek. The trees stood bare, and frost silvered the ground each morning. Evelyn spent her days indoors, surrounded by the quiet hum of her restored home. The repairs were nearly finished now, the roof sealed, the walls painted, the garden trimmed. She no longer feared the house. It had become a companion, its silences familiar, its shadows kind. She sometimes imagined her husband sitting in the armchair by the fire, smiling at her with gentle amusement, as if to say she had finally found her place. One night, as snow began to fall outside, she descended into the cellar one last time. The lantern's glow flickered over the shelves, the books, the carved walls. She felt no cold, no dread. The air was still, serene. She walked to the center of the chamber and placed her hand on the table, whispering the names she had copied from the old ledger. Names she could barely pronounce, yet felt she needed to say aloud. Each one filled the air with a presence, a whisper of memory. When she finished, she left the lantern burning low, its flame steady and sure, and climbed the stairs. That night, she dreamed again. She was standing in the clearing at dawn, the house behind her, the ground beneath her glowing faintly with golden light. The voices from the cellar rose around her, not in fear, but in harmony, a song of gratitude and peace. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, but she was smiling. In the days that followed, no more strangers came. The letters stopped. The world beyond her gate moved on, forgetting what it had once sought to claim. Evelyn lived quietly, tending her garden, reading her books, and writing her thoughts in the same notebook she had carried since her discovery. On the final page, she wrote a single line before closing it for good. The house found me when it was ready, and I listened when it spoke. Years later, when the townspeople spoke of the woman who had lived alone in the house by the trees, they said she was gentle, that she smiled often, but spoke little. They said she had a way of listening that made even silence feel warm. Few knew what truly lay beneath her home, but sometimes, on still nights, those who passed by swore they saw a faint light glowing through the cracks in the ground, as though a candle still burned far below, keeping watch over forgotten stories. Evelyn Harper never left Willow Creek again. She grew old in the house that had once frightened her, and died there quietly one spring morning, sitting on her porch with a book in her lap. When her neighbors found her, her face was peaceful, her eyes half open toward the sunlight. The house stood silent beside her, its paint weathered, its windows reflecting the pale blue of the sky. Beneath it, deep in the earth, the lantern she had left still waited, its flame unquenched, casting a soft glow over shelves of books and letters, a gentle promise kept. The keeper and the kept had become one, bound by the silence that both had chosen. The house had found its guardian, and the secret beneath the floor would never be lost again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what's coming next. Watch our next and previous videos for more unbelievable true stories that will leave you thinking long after they end. And don't keep this one to yourself. Share it with friends and family so they can experience it too.